Okay, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be learning with you here again at Drisha with Between Heaven and Earth, case studies of the tension between Halakha and morality with Rabbi Nati Helfgot. As you come into the Zoom, I will invite you to become a panelist. This doesn't mean we're going to ask you to speak on a panel or anything. It just means that you will have the ability in the Zoom room to turn your camera on if you wish, so we can see your lovely smiling faces, and that you will be able to unmute yourself when Rabbi Helfgot asks for questions and comments. When you're not speaking, we just ask that you keep yourself on mute. It minimizes the background noise so that we can all hear each other. Questions and comments are always welcome in the Zoom chat, or if you're joining us on the Facebook Live, then in the Facebook comments, I'll be checking those. I will be sharing the sources on the screen, and also I will share them in the chat so you can follow along how you wish. And with that, over to Rabbi Helfgot.
Okay, Erev Tov to everyone. A good evening to everyone, and I hope it's good to see some people, and I know that there's more people on the live screen and other things, and people who are joining us. Yes, for those who'd like to follow and hear the sheets, and they're also going to be up on the screen as we start. Last week we explored a number of areas where Halakha, through the vehicle of parshanut, of exegesis, seemed to, and in some places more explicitly, in other places less explicitly, but certainly can be read, and certainly was read by a number of people within the tradition as addressing some of the tension between the straightforward halachic statement and the moral issues that it raises, either moral issues that it raises internally to other passages in the Torah, other values in the Torah, or to certain moral instincts that we believe that are inherent in our Tselem Elokim, the fact that God created us in the image of God and implanted those within us. Tonight we're going to continue. We're going to finish from what we started last week. The last topic, if we can put up the fourth source sheet, we're going to discuss the topic of mamzerut. We're going to discuss the topic of mamzer, the person who is not able to marry. Let's go down. Yeah, let's go all the way down. Right, keep going. Yeah, right there. Thank you. So we'll discuss the topic of mamzerut, which is a very serious and difficult topic. Obviously, we're not going to touch on all the details, but we're just going to try to show, again, that in certain areas, this halakha, which seems to be pretty straightforward, was taken in a different direction, was limited, was given parameters that make it much less common than it might have been. So the Bible says explicitly, Lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem, gam dor asiri lo yavo lo b'kal Hashem. A mamzer cannot enter into the congregation of Israel, meaning he's still a Jew. He gets aliyahs, he has to keep Shabbos, he has to keep kosher, a mamzer, but he's not able to marry another kosher Jew. He's allowed to marry another mamzer, a mamzeret, or a mamzer can marry a mamzer can marry a mamzer, and he may be able to marry other less, quote unquote, other Jews who have less than full qualifications from a yichus point of view. Just I quoted here from the Aish.com, just a very simple definition. In the Talmud itself, I just again want to mention, that the Talmud itself has a three-way debate about who exactly becomes a mamzer, which child of a forbidden union becomes a mamzer. There are very extreme positions that, thank God for us today, were not accepted by mainstream halakha. There is a position in the Talmud that says that basically any forbidden union or any act that is forbidden by the Torah of sexual liaison, automatically, if it produces a child, automatically produces a mamzer, which would mean that, for example, if a single man slept with a woman who was a nidah, who hasn't gone to the mikveh after her period, that child is a mamzer that emerges from that. If we took that position, we would be in very, very, very serious trouble. We'd have millions and millions of mamzerim within Klal Yisrael, within the Jewish people. We do not take that view. We take the view as articulated here. Nice summary. A child that was born into an unmarried woman is simply considered a child born out of wedlock. It's not a mamzer. We don't use the term bastard, which is the English bad translation of mamzer. However, if the woman was married at the time of the conception, she's an eshet ish, then that is adultery, and the child is a mamzer. So mamzerut generally emerges from a relationship that's an arayot, that's considered arayot, except for nida. We do not follow that. Ben nida is not considered a mamzer, except for the son of a nida, provided it can be concluded the paramour rather than the husband is the child's father. So this person is a mamzer. A woman must be sure to receive a proper get if she's being divorced, otherwise she's still considered married, and subsequent children are considered mamzers. It should be stressed that a civil divorce does not sever the marriage from the Jewish point of view. Again, we'll get to that later. Only a get can create. So the concept of mamzer, just from the very beginning, could have been read very broadly. It could have been read very narrowly. In the end, we read it very narrowly. So that's the first limitation that you find in the halakha. But it's still a very challenging notion, because in the end, you find, from a quote-unquote pure justice point of view, that you're visiting, so to speak, the sin of the father on the son, on this child who did nothing wrong. You're visiting. So let's continue. Go back a little bit. So, what is the idea behind it? So, a Jew who is a mamzer must keep all the commandments just like any other Jew, but he does not. But he does have severe limitations regarding who he can marry. The philosophical aspect raises the question: why is the mamzer punished for the parent's mistake? The answer is that adultery or incest, which also produces a mamzer, is one of the most terrible crimes. And the reality is that while people will sometimes hurt themselves, they will think much more carefully about hurting their children. So this is a deterrent factor. So one approach to the idea of mamzer is that, and that's the kind of classical approach that you find amongst the majority of Rishonim, the majority of medieval commentaries, is that it is a deterrence. It's a very strong deterrence, because especially in a society in which being able to marry into the family, and therefore being able to perpetuate your name, being able to pass on your property, your estate, all those things were very central to the society. If you're not able to marry into the mainstream of society, you're basically, cutting off your future. And so hopefully that would give people pause before they let their passions and their lust to commit certain averot overcome them. Hopefully this would, if you know the terrible price that your progeny will pay, then you hopefully will refrain from engaging in the act. So yes, it's at a high cost to the child, but hopefully it's such a deterrent factor that it will limit the mamzerim to a very small number, but the deterrence factor will be so strong that it's worth it for the broader goals of the system, which are to ensure, that marriages, are not undermined by adultery and incest and things like that. So for the greater goal of the system, it's kind of a legitimate price to pay. That's one approach. The other approach, which is what we might call today a more Kabbalistic approach, but it's the more minority view, but you do find it. The Sefer HaChinuch writes, at the root of the precept of mamzer lies the reason that the engendering of a mamzer is very evil, occurring in uncleanliness, abominable thought, and sinful counsel, and there's no doubt that the nature of the father is hidden in the son. Therefore, in his kindness, the eternal Lord removed the progeny of holiness from him, even as he separated us from the evil thing and preventing his people from becoming exposed to such. So this is a much more kind of ontological, essential notion that somehow the mamzer is tainted, and we don't want his being and all of his negative qualities that have been passed on from the father to quote unquote pollute the marriage pool of mainstream of the Jewish people. Again, two different approaches. The first approach is a purely deterrent approach. The second approach is a much more kind of ontological existence, that there's somehow something inherently bad in the mamzer, which again is itself a very challenging notion from a moral point of view. The deterrent factor, I think, is less, but it also still raises the problem. Now, it definitely raises the moral problem, but I do want to point out that Maimonides, in a very famous passage in the Guide for the Perplexed, if we continue down, the Maimonides, in a very famous passage, has a statement that is somewhat shocking to some people, but if you think about it in terms of the fact that God gave law to human beings with all their limitations. So Rambam writes, it is also important to note that the law does not take into account exceptional circumstances. It is not based on conditions which rarely occur. So the Rambam lays down here a marker that the Torah set up a system that's applicable to most people in most cases. That's the nature of a legal system. Nature of a legal system and even a religious legal system is that there are going to be exceptions that don't follow the rule, that the system is trying to achieve goal X, goal Y. There are some people who can achieve that goal by not following the law, but that's a minority. And law, by definition, has to be absolute. Whatever the law teaches, whether it is of an intellectual, what you're supposed to believe, a moral, what you're supposed to do, or a practical character, is founded on which is the rule and not on which is the exception. It ignores the injury that might be caused to a single person through a certain maxim or a certain divine precept. So it's almost a statement, we're using the term today a lot, of collateral damage, that in the nature of, for the greater good of society, there are, laws that may be enacted that, that work for 98% of the populace, and it's for the greater good. But because of that, there are individuals who will suffer along the way. And therefore, it's just a fact. That's what Rambam writes. For the law is a divine institution, and in order to understand that operation, we consider how in nature the various forces produce benefits which are general, but in some solitary cases that can also cause injury. This is clear from what was sent by ourselves as well as by others. We must consequently not be surprised when we find the object of the law does not fully appear in every individual. There must naturally be people who are not perfected by the instruction of the law. We all believe that, keeping halakha and keeping the law will hopefully produce a fine character and connection to God and spiritual benefits. But there are people who they don't fit into those boxes. It's like in education. There are people, for 90% of the kids, this school works for them, but there's going to be 10% that doesn't work for them. So what do you do as a school? So you have to create other kinds of schools, you have to workarounds, whatever. But the reality is that some people don't fit. And for some people, it's like, about structured prayer, that, the rabbis made a decision that structured prayer was going to be the essence of our prayer experience. And they felt that was the right thing. But for many people, for some people, it was clear that wasn't going to be a good solution. But they felt that it was for the benefit, the greater benefits of the society, the greater benefits were outweighed the individuals who may not benefit from that. And therefore, there are people who are not perfected by the instruction of the law, just as there are beings who do not receive the specific forms in nature by all that they require. For all this comes from one God as a result of one act. It is impossible to be otherwise. God exists. God's law exists in the real world. In the real world, human beings have idiosyncrasies. They have differences. They're this. It is impossible to be otherwise. If we have explained that which is impossible always remains impossible, never changes. Since it's part of the nature of society, it's similar to the notion in the natural world. God can't create a stone he can't pick up. From this consideration also follows, continue, that the laws cannot, like medicine, vary according to the different conditions of persons and times. This medicine will work 98% of the time, but there are people who it won't work for. The divine guidance contained in the law must be certain in general, although it may be effective in some cases. If the law depended on the varying conditions of man, it would be imperfect in its totality, each precept being left indefinite. For this reason, it would not be right to make the fundamental principle dependent on a certain time or a certain place. On the contrary, the statutes and judgments must be definite, unconditional, and general, in accordance with the divine words. So once you start with that, you can at least somehow, again, especially if you're working on the deterrence model, so mamzerut is to bigadol is better for all of society. And 98% of the time, it's going to be a deterrence to adultery. Yes, there's going to be 2% that it's not going to be a deterrence. And those people and their children are going to suffer the consequences, but that's part of the collateral damage of setting up the system. Now, what becomes more difficult is this assumes a system in which people are actually deterred. What happens when people don't buy into the system anymore? And then you have a very difficult, which is our modern situation, meaning, it's one thing to use an example that's very prevalent. It's one thing when everyone basically accepts the binding nature of halakha and, are, striving to keep it, but they understand, they realize sometimes that they fail, and they realize that these kind of deterrences are good for society as a whole. What happens when you try to work halakha into a society which doesn't accept the whole authority of halakha? And so it's no longer an individual committing adultery once in a yovel, once in 50 years, but there's tens of thousands of people who have adulterous relationships, and they don't really care. But then the child is left holding the bag. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 or 10. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of people affected. So this is part of the dilemma of our life. It's very similar to coercion in law. People are willing to accept coercion in law if they basically accept the boundaries of the system, right? I might not like the fact that I got a ticket if I was driving 65 in a 45-mile zone, but I understand and accept bigadol in broad terms. I understand, I might not like it. It's not pleasurable, but I basically accept the authority of the state. I basically accept the authority of the police to police the roads and to have traffic laws. And it makes sense to me. And okay, so I was a bad boy, and I'm willing to accept the consequences, even if they're coercive. What happens when you have people who don't accept the basic bindingness of the society, the jurisdiction? And that's what happens when you try to impose halakha on people who are non-religious and don't accept the system milechatchila from the very outset. So that's part of the dilemma. Now, the rabbis, even with these limitations, it's very clear that the rabbis, in a number of places in the Midrash, they gave voice to some of that unfairness that is a result, even if you take Rambam, and even if you understand it's a deterrence, and even if it doesn't affect a lot of people, but still, there's a sense of injustice that this little child, or this, and now who grows up, pays the price for something they didn't actually do, which kind of goes against other passages in the Torah, like Lo Yumtu Avot Al Banim. It says in the book of Dvarim children shouldn't be put to death for the sin of the parents. Ish bechet o yumat, right? Which sounds like, now you could say, oh, that's only limited to the court, and it's only limited to the cases of capital punishment. But the principle is the principle of vicarious punishment, which was rejected by the Torah. So there's a very famous passage, just to give one, there's other passages as well. An example in Vayikra Rabbah. So it says in Kohelet, it says, V'chazarti v'ra'iti et ashukim asher ne'eshakim tachat hashemesh. So the Gemara tells a story. Daniel Chayata. Chayata means he was a tailor. He wasn't even a rabbi. Daniel the tailor interpreted the verse in reference to mamzerim. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed. Dim'at ha'ashukim, the tears of the oppressed. Their fathers violated prohibitions. Why should these wretched people care? If this one's father engaged in incest, in what way did the son sin, and why should he care? But they had no comforter. And ein lahem minachem, it says there. Rather, on the side of their oppressors was power. From the hand of the great Sanhedrin Israel, who came to them by the power of the Torah and sent them away. On account of, it says, a mamzer should not enter the community of the Lord, but they had no comfort. Ein lahem, ein lo minachem. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, it falls upon me to comfort them. For in this world, they contain chaff. But regarding the future, Zechariah said, I saw him comprised entirely of pure gold. So the Midrash here is addressing the injustice, the unfairness of the mamzerim, of the law of mamzerut to these individuals. It doesn't throw out the law because that's not within the power of the rabbis to do. The rabbis can't negate the law, but they can express their discomfort with the law. And in a midrashic play, they can say that in the future, God himself will comfort them and turn them into pure gold and allow them, it's like we'll take away the dross and we'll allow them to fully be integrated into Klal Yisrael. So there's this kind of vision that at some point, the pain of the mamzerim will be redeemed and their status will be redeemed. Now, that's a pretty explicit statement of the discomfort that the rabbis had with the laws of mamzerim. This discomfort yields certain halachic ramifications, because if you accept that there's a certain tension here, and you don't simply turn your face away, but you recognize that the rabbis themselves saw mamzerut as a problem halakha, so then you find it's easier to understand a number of halachic limitations on mamzerut. So, for example, if we keep going down, the Gemara in Kiddushin says, our sages taught, in the future, mamzerim and netinim, which is another kind of group of people who are not sure about their lineage, halachically, these will be pure, meaning they'll be purified. Somehow God will remove their status. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi, that somehow in the future, when the Messiah comes, even though we generally believe that there'll be no change in the halacha, but somehow they will be somehow purified. What is meant by that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness? Rabbi Yitzchak said, the Holy One, blessed be he, acted charitably for a family that has become assimilated, has become assimilated. The word assimilated here does not mean assimilated like we use it today. The word in Hebrew is nitma with nun tet mem ayin. Assimilated means it's a family that's already for many generations has been accepted into Klal Yisrael. We don't start doing investigations. You kind of don't ask, don't tell. A family that has for years been accepted as a legitimate part of Klal Yisrael, even if you have maybe some doubts here and there, Chazal say, that's it. We act charitably. A family that became assimilated has become assimilated. Let's continue reading. The law that a family has become assimilated, that is to say, a family of mamzerim became mixed up in Yisrael, its legitimacy may not be consent is unprecedented in halacha. No one would think to say that a pig which has become assimilated is assimilated. It seems that we can identify here the considerations that we saw above were stated elsewhere explicitly. Moral considerations. I think this is from an essay. I don't remember, but I think it's from an essay by Rabbi Clapper. Moral considerations brought Chazal to try and minimize the scope of the prohibitions pertaining to mamzerim as much as possible. On the other hand, we also see here the utilization of moral consideration as an exegetical tool is not unlimited and all-powerful. Chazal did not nullify the laws of mamzerim that are mentioned explicitly in the Torah. They could only limit them. So this is an approach. Chazal here, driven by the ethos that there's a problem with mamzerim, start to limit the power. And so once, if people looked away 3, 4, 5 generations and allowed this family to marry, we don't look too carefully into the back. Continue. Let's go further. Yeah, does it go further or that's it?
This is the end of this source sheet. Should I go to source sheet 5?
Oh, no, but that doesn't. Okay. I thought I had included a couple of more sources, but there are other examples of this in Halakha. The Gemara says in one place, Vadai mamzer velo safek mamzer, that in certain halachos we only say that it's only if it's a definite mamzer and not a safek mamzer. So again, you see that there are great efforts that are made to try to undo and undermine as much as possible the scope of the laws of mamzerim. And one can even see that undertow in the famous ruling of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which on the one hand was very progressive, on the other hand was seen by non-Orthodox streams as very divisive, but from the point of view of Klal Yisrael was very progressive. What do I mean? In the 1950s and 60s, so with the as the reform and conservative movement became further and further away from classical halachic practice, especially in the more extreme wings of each movement. So questions came up about the efficacy of conservative and reform gittin, divorces. Because if you felt that those gittin were not kosher, then you have a problem. The people are still married, and if they're still married, if they remarry, they're Eshet Ish. The woman is an Eshet Ish. She's a married woman, and the children, by definition, are then mamzerim. And you could then have hundreds of thousands of mamzerim because the majority of Jews do not marry Orthodox, and so you have a problem. So Rav Moshe gave the famous tshuva in the 50s and 60s, in which he basically made the daring claim, which was vehemently disagreed with by other rabbis, but eventually became the standard within the halachic community, certainly as a default, where Rav Moshe said that reform and conservative marriages are not halachic marriages, and therefore they don't require a halachic get. Because since many of the actions which are taken, certainly in reform marriages, and even in many conservative marriages, don't have kosher witnesses, or don't this, all kinds of technical issues, Rav Moshe raised and kind of wholesale said, the default is that the average reform and conservative marriage doesn't rise to the level of a halachic marriage. If it doesn't rise to the level of a halachic marriage, they're not married, they're just living together. And the fact that they're living together doesn't create a halachic marriage, doesn't have a halachic marriage. It doesn't require a halachic get. Doesn't require a halachic get. If they get divorced and then remarried, there's no mamzerim problems because originally they were never married. Now, from the point of view of many reform and conservative rabbis, this was deeply offensive because Rav Moshe was undermining their religious status by saying that their religious, even though in halakha, a marriage is not actually a sacrament like it is in Christianity, right? You don't need a rabbi to marry anybody. Two Jews, a a woman and a man with two witnesses, kosher witnesses, can get married. Even the halacha that you need a 10 men, a minyan to see it is a later addition. It's not an essential halacha. If two people get married, if a man and a woman get married, and they're two kosher witnesses, they're married. Halachically, they're married. No, they need a get, etc., to undo the marriage. You certainly don't need a smorgasbord. You don't need a band. You don't need a chuppah. You don't need any. Again, they're married. Now, Rav Moshe said the fact that they lived together as husband and wife for 20 years doesn't matter halachically. Since the kiddushin was not done halachically, they're not married. Now, many disagreed with Rav Moshe. Most famously, the great posek on the Lower East Side, Rav Henkin, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, disagreed vehemently with Rav Moshe and said, no, it's true that you can find all kinds of holes in the actual act of kiddushin, but since they got married and they live as husband and wife, they're not living just shacking up. They're living as husband and wife. That in and of itself creates marriage, and you need to get to undo that kind of marriage. And so Rav Henkin disagreed vehemently with Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe himself said, L'chatchila, you should always try to get a get. You should always ideally get a get from this kind of situation. But if you can't get a get, you're wrong. And this is what allows American Jewry till today to continue to marry each other, because otherwise, Bali Tshuva would be in tremendous problem. Bali Tshuva would be in a terrible situation, a terrible pickle, because if they were still married, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands would be mamzer, can't marry. So this is another expression of that very deep recognition of that the very fact that Chazal themselves had qualms about mamzerus, I think pushed Rav Moshe to go the extra mile to try to find a way to avoid mamzerim, even if it was, again, he was willing to go out on a limb and do this because to avoid mamzerim as much as possible. And since that's a desiratum to try to avoid mamzerim, he felt justified in going that far. Okay, now let's go to our next topic, which is again another very interesting example, less practical, but again, it's interesting because it raises all kinds of interesting halachic, meta-halachic, and system-wide discussion. So even though it seems out of place, we'll at least start. I don't know if we'll finish tonight, but we'll at least start tonight. So if we get up the fifth source sheet. So I'd like to discuss tonight, the second half of the shir tonight, about Hanidachat. Hanidachat is the city that has gone to the dark side, as we say. It's a city that has been totally convinced to violate the laws of idolatry and the Bible. So let's read what the Bible says. If you hear about a city, Yatsu Anashim B'nei Belial, terrible, horrible people went out. Vayadichu et Yoshvei Ram. They seduced and corrupted the people in the city. Let us go and worship Avodah Zarah. Let's go and worship foreign gods. And you, the Jewish community, examines and finds out, and you find out that it's true, that this terrible abomination has occurred. Go and kill out everybody in the city by sword. Totally destroy it, raze it to the ground, and everything in it, and all its animals. And all of the booty that's left, you can't take it home. You have to take it into the town square. So it sounds very much that, again, if you don't know anything of Chazal, before Chazal start to pick apart this section, the impression one gets from Pshuto Shel Mikra, from the plain sense of the text, is that this city, which has gone over to the dark side, and is a city committed to Avodah Zarah, is treated as an enemy city. You attack it like in war. The language is war language. If you compare the language here to the language in chapter 20 of the book of Deuteronomy, which talks about waging war against the inhabitants of the land of Israel when you're trying to conquer the land of Israel, it's the same language. Hakeh, verse 16. Hakeh takeh et yoshvei ir. Totally smite the people. Lefi charev, according to the sword. The sword here is not the sword of a court system. This is not a criminal adjudication. It doesn't say take them to court. It doesn't say bring witnesses. Notice, it doesn't say anything about all the procedures that we know. It doesn't say anything about hatra'ah, about giving warning. It doesn't say anything about witnesses. It doesn't say anything about court. It sounds like we're in a different sphere. We're in the sphere of war. This is a cancer. From the perspective of the Bible, Avodah Zarah is the most terrible thing that can happen. Idolatry eats away at the covenant between God and the Jewish people, especially when they're coming to the land of Israel. It has to be destroyed. The cities should be destroyed. Everything in it, and everybody in it, and all the animals and all the property and everything. It sounds like it's a kind of total war where you totally destroy everything in its path. And the Bible says you should destroy it. It should be a tel olam lo tibaneod. It shouldn't be rebuilt. You shouldn't take anything, not even one thing from this city, which is now cherem, which is now forbidden to Leman Yashuv Hashem mecharon hapo, so God will turn back from His anger. And He will give you rachamim. We're going to have to examine what that's about. He'll give you mercy and show you mercy when you listen to God's voice. So now, again, as I said, this has nothing to do, when you read it, prima facie, has nothing to do with the legal system. Chazal, however, did not read it that way. Chazal took this very harsh law, which says basically, raise the city to the ground, which doesn't sound like you leave anybody living. You simply destroy the city, the men, the women, the children. Notice there's no investigation about, is everybody in the city culpable? Is everybody in the city not culpable? What's the status of the children? It sounds like it's, you kind of just flatten the city and destroy it without questions. Because of the danger of Avodah Zarah, you simply flatten it. When you turn to the Mishnah, however, the Mishnah has, in effect, defangs some of this. And again, it may be, and as we'll see in subsequent Rishonim, that part of the issue was taking it literally raised certain moral questions that were, that Rishonim were not willing, and the Chazal maybe, and certainly Rishonim were not willing to go down. So let's look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah, then source number 2 says, very famously, we know that there are 4 types of capital punishment in Jewish law. Arba mitot nimsru lebeis din. There are 4 types of capital punishment in a regular court case. If somebody is liable for capital punishment: skila, stoning; sreifa, burning; hereg, which basically means decapitation; and chenek, strangulation. Rabbi Shimon says the hierarchy is a little different. In the Tanakama says the hierarchy is skila is the most severe. Rabbi Shimon says sreifa, the burning; sekila, chenek, the hereg. And then the Mishnah in Perek Zayin starts to list which categories of sins yield the various types of capital punishment. So it starts with haniskalin. It starts with those things which a person is liable for stoning. In chapter 9, it gets to the burning. And at the end, it says Eluhein hanisrafim. These are the ones that you get burned for, this Avera, that Avera. And then the last line of the first Mishnah, Ve'eluhein haneheragim. And these are those who are punished in a court with hereg, with a sword, with decapitation. Rotseach, a murderer, Ve'anshei ir hanidachat, and the people of the city that is ir hanidachat. The term ir hanidachat comes from the fact that if we go back up a little bit, you go back to the beginning, you look at the verse. The verse says in line 2 that you hear about a city, Yatsu b'nei Belial mikibecha vayadichu, and they corrupted, they seduced, they convinced the people of the city to go and worship Avodah Zarah. So when we come back down to source number 3, the rabbinic term that's created is called Anshe Ir Hanidachat, the people of the city that has been turned towards Avodah Zarah, that's been corrupted to Avodah Zarah, Ir Hanidachat. So notice what the Mishnah has done. The Mishnah takes a war scenario where we basically turned inward and basically wiped away a city in Israel because of Avodah Zarah, and turns it into a legal category, where implying that it's not just that you go in willy-nilly and just indiscriminately, since this city has been tagged as a dangerous city, you don't simply flatten it, but there seems to be a court procedure that has to be followed in order to put these people, or some of these people, to death. That itself is a radical shift. It's a radical shift. This is also explicit in another interesting shift. The Midrash Tanaim on Devarim writes as follows. The Bible says that if you examine and find out Ne'esta hatoiva hazot, this abomination has been done in Israel, Lama Ne'emar, why do you have to make that so explicit? If you examine and find that this abomination has been done, Lama Ne'emar says, why does it have to say that phrase? Lefi shenemar hakei takei. Because in the beginning it says hakei takei, you shall go in and destroy the city. And I'm going to add, implying that this is a wartime battle, that you leave no prisoners, and it's not a judicial, it's not a police action, it's a war of total destruction. So I might have think, Shameani echad tzadikim ve'echad rishaim, that you go in and you make no distinctions. You go in and you kill everybody, and you don't ask. The city has been marked, and therefore, even if there's some tzaddikim, even if there's some righteous people left, they die together with the Rishaim. Oil Russia, oil Shcheno. Collateral damage. Now you can make it a little softer that the tzaddikim die because you don't have to worry about collateral damage. You don't have to worry about the civilian population. You simply shoot. If the building houses 90 Rishaim and there's 10 tzaddikim, you don't have to worry about the 10 tzaddikim because that's the way you have to kill them. That's the way you have to kill them. That's why the Bible has to say, Na'asta hatoiva hazot. If this abomination was done, it has to be you only kill the people who've done the abomination. Ha'ovdim bilvad. You have to make sure that you only kill those who actually worshipped Avodah Zarah. You have to ferret out, and you have to find out exactly who did the Avodah Zarah and who didn't do the Avodah Zarah. When the Bible says before, V'darashta v'chakarta heitev, v'shalta heitev, does not mean that you simply have to find out if these rumors are true, that this city has gone over to the Avodah Zarah. You actually have to put into place a judicial process of examining and investigating who did the Avodah Zarah and who didn't. And you have to have the principle of distinction, like in today. You have to see who's innocent and who's guilty. which leads the Rambam, which leads the rabbis to say things like the following in the Mishnah, in Perek Yud. Anshe ir Hanidachat, the people of the city, of the bad city. It says, Yatsu anshe b'nei ba'al mikirbecha v'dichot yeshvim le'mor. Ein neheragim, we don't kill them at shuma dichel me'oto ha'ir. We have all kinds of restrictions. They have to be from the same city. U'me'oto ha'shevet. V'ad sheyudach ruba, and it has to be the majority. V'ad sheyedechu anashim, has to be men, not women. And then it says, Hidichu nashim uktanim, if the people leading the corruption were men, women, or children. O shehudach miuta, only a majority went over to the dark side. O shayuma dichel michutzla, or there was an external force that led people to over Zarah. Hare'elu ki yechidim, everybody is treated like a yachid. Then the Mishnah continues, Tzrichim shnei edim v'hatra'ah l'chol echad ve'echad. You require 2 witnesses, and you need warning for every person that you kill. This is the stringency when it comes to evaluating an individual avodah zarah nik somewhere in the country, as opposed to evaluating the people in the city of avodah zarah. Shayechidim b'skila, lefikach mamonam pala, the people who are yechidim. If an individual is caught doing avodah zarah, he is stoned, and his money goes on to his goes on to his relatives. V'amerubim, but the people, if it's a city where the majority has done avodah zarah and they're judged b'sayif, they are killed by the sword of decapitation. The frame b'sayif refers to the legal proceeding, and that leads Rambam to have this very fascinating formulation where he tries to integrate both elements that we've seen in the sources. Rambam writes, Hilchot Akum, Perek Dalet. What is the law of the Hanidachat? When it's been determined that this is a city where the majority have fallen for avodah zarah, for idolatry, Beit Din HaGadol, the Beit Din in Jerusalem, Sholchin v'dorshin v'chokrim, they investigate ad she'edu b'raya brura, until they know for sure. Hadacha shehidcha kol ha'ir or ruba v'chazru l'avodas kocham, that all or most of the city has committed itself to avodah zarah. Achar kach sholchim lahem shnei tamidei chachamim l'hasiram v'l'achziram. Afterwards, you send 2 scholars to warn them. Notice that doesn't appear in the Bible. In the Bible, it says you go, you find out, you attack, destroy the city. All of a sudden, this is based on the rabbis, you give them a chance to do tshuva. Im chazru v'asu tshuva mutav. The im yamdu be'ivaltan. So if they do tshuva, great. And if not, if they stand in their rebellion, if they stand in their evil way, Beit Din mitzuvim l'chol Yisrael la'alot aleim litzava. Then the Beit Din commands all of Israel to attack them with an army. It sounds like it's war, right? They ain't sarim aleim, and they put a siege. You do war until the city is breached. Once the city is breached, miyad mirubim lahem batei dinim v'daninotan. All of a sudden, you flood the city with courts and judge them individually. Kol mi sheba'u alav shnei edim shavad kochav. Any person who you have 2 witnesses that worshipped avodah zarah, achar shehitru oto, after he had been warned, mafrishin oto, you separate him. Nimtzu kol ha'ovdim mu'uta soklin otam. Ushar ha'ir nitzol. If it turned out that it was only a minority of the city that did avodah zarah, you stone those people who did avodah zarah, and the rest of the city is saved. Nimtzu rabba. Keep going down. If, however, the majority of the city, if you count up, Malin Otan Lebeitin Hagado, then you bring them back to the high court, Vigomrim Sham Dinam, and you finish their court there, V'horgin Kol Elu Sha'avdu B'Saif, and you kill them with the sword. Umakin et Kol Nefesh. Okay, so this is okay, and the Rambam and the Rambam seems to say that this is a kind of mixture of a war plus a baked-in kind of situation. So you have here this interesting situation. Now, what happens to the women and to the children, especially the children? So this was an interesting debate. Rambam said the children are also killed, the children of those who are found guilty. This was a debate. If you look at source number 7, look at source number 7. Source number 7 says, you kill et Yoshvei ha'irahim. Mikan amru ein mikaymin et hatfalim. From here we learn that you kill everybody, including the children who committed avodah zarah, which is very strange. In general, children are not held responsible for averas. Abba Chanan Omer, no. You can't hold the children responsible. And again, he's assuming, I mistranslated. He says that you kill the children because of the parents. Abba Chanan Omer, it says in the Bible, Lo yimtu avot al banim. You cannot kill the fathers for the children. You can't kill the children for the fathers. The Gemara, the Tosefta, makes it very clear that here we are, that here we are actually, we have a debate. So Abba Chanan said we can't hold the children responsible for the parents. The Tosefta, Tannaitic work, has a little bit different take, but again, interesting debate. Ktanei b'nei anshe ir Hanidachat, shehudchu ima, the children of the ir Hanidachat that also violated ein neheragim. The Tanakh Rambam says they can't be killed, they're children. They're not held liable. Rabbi Lezer Omer neheragim. They are killed. Amalei Rabbi Kiva, Mani Mekayim. What does it mean in the Bible when it says V'natan lecha rachamim? God will give you mercy. V'rechamcha v'hir b'cha. If it means that we should show mercy on the adults, it says you should kill them. You got to kill the animals. Mani Mekayim v'natan lecha rachamim. Elu ktanim b'shibitocha. This refers to the ketanim. This refers to the children. Now, this too, here you have this debate. Now, if we go down all the way, let's skip number 9 and skip number 10 and go to a number 11. What happens is that this debate, of course, has to be adjudicated. And some Rishonim decided that in Achanami, indeed, we will hold the children responsible for their actions and kill them, even though in general, in Jewish law, you don't hold children responsible for their actions, and certainly not for the actions of their parents. If we're talking about children who just are the offspring. Can we just get rid of, I just want to see source 11, so if we can get rid of, yeah. So the Yad Ramah, and we'll close with this tonight, the Yad Ramah, who was Rameir Abulafia, one of the great scholars of Sfarad in the time of the Rambam, he writes as follows. He says, Tamu ali mashu omer. It's very difficult to me what Maimonides writes, Makinet kol ataf et kol nashim lefichar. you kill all the women and the children, which of course raises all kinds of moral qualms. Elu anashim ketzad. What does it mean, the women? Im avdu avodah zarah, if they actually worship, hainu ir hanidachat ish anshe ir hanidachat gufam. They themselves are part of the ir hanidachat, and they should be held liable, not because they're married to anybody, they're liable. The im lo avdu avodah zarah, if they didn't, madua neragot. Why should they be killed? Tuvia chata. If Tuvia sinned, v'zigud mangid, and zigud should be punished, that's not fair. V'od. Second of all, mashu omer makinet kol ataf. You kill the children. Listen to what he says, and this is a great example. V'chalila la'el meresha, and God forbid that we should attribute to God such wickedness. Where in the Bible do we find that a katan is held responsible? V'od. We don't find such a thing. He says, we don't find such a thing. And how can you go against the basic ethos of the Torah of that the Bible says that a child is not held responsible until a certain age? And how can we do that? What are we talking about? And so Yad Ramah, again, it's very beautiful that he introduces here a kind of global statement about the nature of God. It says it cannot be that that's the correct psak, because that flies in the face of the meta halachic understanding that God is not a God of wickedness, and holding a child responsible when the Bible always seems to say that children are not held responsible for the actions, certainly of their parents, and certainly they're not held responsible for their own actions until a certain age of maturity. So it flies against the face of the notion of a righteous God. And again, this is an interesting example again of how the Rishonim, I think, certain Rishonim, took the ethos that they saw unfold in front of them in the halachic understanding of Ir Hanidachat, to take it from a purely war kind of absolute destruction, no questions asked, just flatten, to a much more rigid kind of legal process. Once you're working in the legal process, it has to work within the legal categories. And in the legal categories, children aren't held responsible for the things that they do. They're certainly not held responsible for the acts of their parents. And so it can't be that that's the correct psak. So this is, again, an interesting how interpretive moves and moral understandings of the nature of God and the system certainly push certain understandings in psak halacha in certain directions as opposed to other directions. Okay. Im Yirtzeh Hashem. So just again to remind everybody, next week there is no class. Next week I am going to be on a plane to Israel on 2 missions to Israel. We will have our next class on Monday, November 27th. Monday, November 27th. So there's no class November 20th, but November 27th and December the 4th. Is that the Monday, December the 4th? Is that the last Monday? The last class? 7 classes, yeah?
Yeah, yes, December the 4th, sorry, yeah.
December the 4th will be the last class, and we'll finish up with that. I want to wish everybody, I want you to go to sleep, so that for those who are going to the rally tomorrow, so you can get up nice and early and reach Washington in time and be able to march over, and everyone should be safe, and we should all, hopefully it'll be a successful march and a successful rally. Erev Tov to everybody, and have a good week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot. We're all wishing you safe travels on your mission, and thank you to everyone here for being part of our learning community. Just a quick reminder that we have many more amazing classes this fall's Zman at Drisha. You can find out more about all of them and register at 5784.drisha.org/fall. See you the next time we meet, not next week.
All right, 2 weeks. Okay, bye-bye.